What I'd like to do is, first of all, start by saying thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for being a part of the discussion. A lot of what we're trying to do is think about this topic of de-risking medtech, which is a really big statement, and it's a very difficult thing for us to be contemplating, but with your help, we believe that we'll be able to do that. Our goal tonight is to seek your input, and as I'd shared with our three panelists, it's not our collective goal to present to you, but instead to think about things with you and to be sharing some thoughts and perspectives. And so please, I will be saying early on what is on your mind. So just to set your expectation, I'll be going to the audience and asking for your thoughts, your comments. I've spoken with some of you. I know many of you in the room have a perspective, and I'm going to ask you to be open and candid in sharing that. Our goal as SGInnovate is simple, and that is we believe fundamentally that Singapore has everything that it needs in order to build globally relevant deep tech companies. Now, what we say by deep tech is we believe that those things that are technology intensive, a higher barrier to entry, often founded on scientific research, something that fewer people can pursue, but might also have a different gestation period because the market generally understands B2C and understands certain things differently. We are aspiring to do things that we think will be important, but also have a positive impact on humanity. And we don't think that those have to be thought of independently. We think we can do something important and something that's economically rewarding. So our goal is to back ambitious and capable men and women that want to do that. And we say ambitious and capable because many people are ambitious and many people are capable, but not many people are both. And so for those that want to take that leap, want to be founders, want to pursue something entrepreneurial, or to be a member of an early stage team, we want to try and help. We invest, we focus on talent acquisition, we try and be useful in customer acquisition. It's about that basic. We're a private limited company by structure. We have one shareholder, Ministry of Finance. So we are connected with, but we also maintain a healthy distance from the machinery of government. And we do that because we think we can be important if we keep a foot in both camps. So tonight's about MedTech. We've got some great panelists, and what I'd like to do is, before we get started, I'm going to hand over to my friend and teammate, Xian-Wei. Xian-Wei, can I ask you to give some comments, please?
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's always a very difficult thing to follow Steve, because he's such a smooth orator and he delivers everything so well. So all I can say is, to reiterate my thanks to all of you. I know that this is a very busy week, especially since it's the festive season, and I'm glad that you've made us part of your program. I've had a few of you come up to me and say, hey, this is very different from the usual SGInnovate events that you hold at Carpenter Street. For one thing, the setting's nicer. But more importantly, the drinks are a hell of a lot better than what you have back there. So I've got to put some context into why we are doing this. And as Steve has alluded to it a little bit in what he said, which is really that, investing in deep tech is not quite the same as investing in your usual general ICT startups, where there are the usual ratios and benchmarks that you can draw from the, from the data that's provided by the companies. And then from there, you can sort of have a gauge as to whether or not you want to proceed with it. Deep tech comes with a lot more complex variables, a lot more complex situations that warrant a lot more thought before a decision can be made. Some of those include things like, regulatory hurdles, regulatory compliance, time to market. But at the end of the day, when we look at deep tech, it can also be a very fulfilling and also a very lucrative investment proposition, especially if the risk assessment has been done correctly. So it's for this reason that actually we are embarking on a series of deep tech investment talks geared primarily at investors, like most of you here today, but we also invite people in the ecosystem to come in and participate in the conversation so that all of us learn together. And ultimately, we hope that, together we are going to learn how to build a proper model or build models for investment in deep tech for the betterment of the overall ecosystem. Now, tonight we decided to start with MedTech. The reason why is because MedTech probably encompasses most of the problems that we face when we look at deep tech. It's got regulatory compliance issues. It's got slow time to market. You almost need a crystal ball to decide, whether or not the market is going to be there by in 3 years' time when the product actually gets to market. There are challenges with finding the right people, especially the right people who want to work for startups. And of course, there are a whole host of other issues like, market acceptance, distribution, manufacturing. So tonight, I think we are all very honored, and I'm sincerely looking forward to the expert panelists who will come up and talk a little bit more about this. I've had a look at some of their profiles, and all of them have got either experience in bringing technology from the lab to the market, or experience in investing in this space and exiting. So I look forward to having a fantastic conversation with them. With that, I wish all of you a pleasant and fruitful evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sin-Wei. Okay, what I'd like to do is I'm going to try an experiment because we're always interested in experimenting. And so I'm going to introduce the three panelists. I'm going to ask them to join me on stage. What we're going to do is take just a moment or two to share a thought or a perspective as the panelists, to frame perhaps a little bit about what we're thinking for this evening. And then we're going to take about a 5-6 minute break for you to digest that, refill your glasses, get back to your seats. So please, with this experiment, don't turn that into a chance to, grab a drink and go stand outside and chat with your friends. We're going to come right back. But what I wanted to do is frame the discussion and then let you reflect on that for a moment, because I do want to engage. So what I'm going to do is ask in the next minute here for the panelists to join me. They will introduce themselves, because I'm a believer that panelists can always do a better job introducing themselves than any moderator could. So what I'm going to do is ask Nick Roelofs to come up, please. Nick, if you would join us, please. Jean-Luc Butel and Seemant Jauhari. Okay, what I'm going to do, gentlemen, is just go down the row. I'm going to ask you just to give whatever intro you would like of yourself. And then here's the question that I would like for us to be thinking about as a team tonight. We believe, as I mentioned a moment ago, that Singapore has some very exciting science and research and education foundation upon which billions and billions of dollars has been spent, and investments have been made, and investments are forecasted to be made for the years ahead. So let's take as a given that the science and the education may not be our weak link. Let's assume that we have liquidity between GIC and Temasek and all the investment funds that each of you represent. Let's assume that we have a supportive government environment, as in doing something with all of these assets is important to Singapore. So let's assume that those things are generally given. We're not doing as much as we might like upon this science and research foundation, and we know that. We want to be honest about that. So part of the discussion tonight is, where do we begin? Is it we need more of this or less of that? I'd like to be very honest and candid about what's working and what's not, because we have a simple goal, and that is to improve things. And I hope everybody in the room came tonight with the intent of improving things. So Jean-Luc, if you want to introduce yourself, and then against this context of you've been in Singapore, you serve on various boards here and overseas, do you have something that perhaps is food for thought that you might put forward to the audience in terms of how you think of this problem of Singapore, or anyone else, being a successful and healthy ecosystem?
Thanks, Steve, and good evening, everybody. So I spent 33 years with basically Medtech companies, Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, Becton Dickinson, and Baxter. I've seen big investments in Medtech, up to $1 billion, and I've seen a lot of startup. I still see a lot of startup. I came back to Singapore 3 years ago because I believe there's a great marketplace and a great government institution here to help foster innovation. I would say a couple of things. Medtech, if we still try to define it the old traditional way, we can debate what that means, by the way. The lines have been completely blurred, and because we, I think, are at the time where there is a huge convergence on technology, chemistry, biology, AI, 3D printing, tissue engineering, genomics, name it. And all of that is changing medtech, tremendously. And I think one of the challenges that we need to understand, and Singapore, in a sense, I think is a great petri dish, if I can use that expression, because I believe we can pilot a lot of things in Singapore. We don't do that enough, so to me that would be an area where we should do more, where we can pilot a lot of solutions quite quickly, quite cheaply, and then see if we can duplicate that in overseas market. So I will stop here for now, and which way do you want to go?
Please, Nick.
So thank you. So my name's Nick Roelofs. I've got 30 years experience as an operating executive in companies of all sizes. I've done 3 startups. I've taken 1 intermediate-sized company public, but most of my career has been in large companies, and it's always been in the tools and diagnostics space. And I came up through R&D, so I started as an R&D guy and moved all the way up. The past 5 years, I've spent being on boards of venture companies, a couple of larger companies as well, and I've been working for Nordic Capital, which is a large private equity company. So I have a landscape perspective of having been in public equity, having been in private equity, and also all my friends are venture guys. So I'm in the process of starting a venture fund. I'll be opening that fund this year. I'm in the process of going through MAS and all the things to do that. The fund is focused on life science tools and diagnostic, Singapore-based. I am a dog, so it is a good year for me to open a fund. And we will open the fund after next week. Actually, it'll be about 4 or 5 months. But the lucky Earth dog should bring this fund to market. The comment I'll make is I can echo what the 2 gentlemen to my right just said. So Steve and Jean-Luc echoed for me. Singapore has tremendous intellectual talent, and it has tremendous science talent. And your government has poured a lot of money into seeding science and creating seed opportunities. There seems to be some gap, and it's how does this not get out of the box? And it's not a zero-sum game. There are examples of success, but they are limited relative. I live most of my life in Silicon Valley, so I spend about 1/3 of my life in Silicon Valley, 1/3 of my life in London, 1/3 of my life here. I see very different environments, and so that's, I think, where I'll stop, but that's kind of my perspective.
Seemant.
Hi, I'm Seemant. I bring 17 years of experience. I've been in business consulting in EY, and then post that for the last 7.5, 8 years at Apollo Hospitals, one of the leading hospital chains in India. I am currently running HealthXCapital, which is a new early stage venture capital fund focused on Southeast Asia, India, basically growth markets, but not limited to these. I think what I have seen 2 roles now where I come from, it's from a provider context, from the hospital context, where I've seen closure of the loop to benefit patients is an extremely important aspect that I've seen as the head of innovations of India's largest hospital chain. And that's usually been a challenge when we've been looking at a lot of innovations coming to Apollo. Although it might be monetarily very beneficial, the challenge was always whether it will get adopted by doctors and whether it ultimately impacts the patient. Now that said, I'll park that thought for a second, and I sort of now straddle with this role, which is the investor hat, while putting on the venture capital hat. And what I see here is actually there's a lack of connectivity between the different stakeholders which are required for making that idea into a commercialization or commercializable idea at the end of it, which means all these stakeholders in between, which is the startup to the venture capital, to the provider ecosystem, to the insurance, and then the distributors. I think somewhere all of these have a role to play in realizing that idea and bringing it to market, but somehow we tend to organically only solve that problem when we go through the journey, but it's not all there together. And that's, I think, what is missing, is connecting that dots. And to, at the end of it, connecting it to the original idea to start with innovations which actually solve a problem at the end of it and close the loop with the patient. So those are 2 aspects I find which are actually, one is a challenge and one is kind of inadequacy in our system, which I think we should sort of stress upon. I've seen Israel a lot, and one thing I'd say, Steve, is I go there every year, and I think Singapore is on its way doing very, very similar stuff, and I feel very, very bullish about what I'm seeing out here.
Thank you. Well, here's what I'd like to propose, is many of you in the room could have been sitting in any of these chairs because you have experiences and insights and a lot of ideas. So I'm hopeful that tonight this is going to be an easy ride for me as the moderator, because sometimes I have to work hard to get people engaged. Tonight, I hope that I'll have to work hard on the other side, which is thank you for all your input. It's time for us to have some food together. So please, what I'm going to suggest is we'll just take a 5-minute break, refill, recharge your glasses, and I want to come back in and I want to dig in. But I'm going to go out to you early, ask for your perspective, your insight, your feedback, for the simple reason that we do want to come away from tonight saying, okay, instead of observing these 3 or 4 issues, here's some things that we collectively can do. What can we do as SGInnovate? What can we ask for your help with? What can you do? And how can we be helpful to you? So our goal is not to observe and list as much as it is to try and discuss and take some specific action. Because I'm starting from the perspective that we all want the same thing, which is to get more out of this ecosystem because we think the ecosystem is worthy of that. So we'll take 5 minutes and we'll come right back. Okay, well, I hope that the opportunity to swap some stories and shake hands with people around you was helpful. I always think that's one of the highlights of any event like this. So thank you for that. What I'm going to do now is start off, and I'm asking for your active engagement if I didn't already make that appeal earlier. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go around and just ask 1 or 2 quick questions of our panelists, and I'd like then to go to you. So if I take a look, Jean-Luc, you have been leading the development of markets and businesses for major medtech-related firms, but things are changing. And so when you mentioned earlier artificial intelligence, you mentioned earlier some things like genomic sequencing. Can you help us? Can you help us with perhaps your definition of what you think we should be including in this label of medtech? Is there a way for us to think about something that we call medtech?
No. No, I mean, what I was saying in my opening remarks is we need to walk away, and I think this, by the way, doesn't apply just to medtech. You look at financial services, you look at so many domains in the economy, the all defining rigid lines are gone. And so I forgot, someone was mentioning about connecting the dots, right? I mean, this is exactly what it is. Today, if you want to be successful, so tonight it's about medtech, you need to be able to connect several dots. Yes, you have your traditional patient and physician and payer and providers and all of that, right? Whether it's a hospital, private payer, etc. But the complexity today and the speed at which technology, and I will take technology in a broad sense, okay? So I imply in technology artificial intelligence, I imply miniaturization, I imply nanotechnology. It is moving so incredibly fast that your business model as an innovator has to be able to have that built-in flexibility. And that built-in flexibility is critical not only from a technology platform, but because your business model changes every day. So if you have a long development platform and you do not have that built-in flexibility, you would be dead. So I would say that business model, you need to have a finger on it. So as investors also, you understand how that business model is going to evolve. The second point is, as technology becomes more and more sexy, if I may say so, very often, and I've seen that, and I've seen major groups investing behind technology that is incredibly, by the way, with J&J, we did that mistake, and I burned $200 million of J&J money on a technology that was amazing, but we forgot the business model. And so to me, your ability to really keep connecting your technology with the business model, and your business model has to be as innovative as your technology is. And the reason I'm saying that is because medtech and regulators will put you in a box that is so rigid. And so most of the time I see a lot of innovation that loses all of its value because it goes into the box. And nobody thought during that innovation process to say, how is my business model going to be as innovative as my technology? So that to me is a huge point.
So, Nick, one of the things that we think about when we have other events and we talk about artificial intelligence and we talk about exponential growth and the factor that now compute power makes so many things possible. In medicine, when you take a look at some of the areas that you're evaluating for investment, do you count on some amount of exponential growth being there for us in perpetuity? Do you have to make some assumptions that what's happening now will continue to happen? Or do you assume that at some point this thing sort of flattens off and we have to think about things in a bit more, if I use the word, familiar perspective? Because exponentiality just becomes mind-blowing if we go out 10 or 12 years into the future. But in the specific area of medicine, when you look at investments, how do you think about some of this future world and how it might evolve?
Yeah. So I think there's, at the long tail, the cap, so if I start at the 100,000 plus foot level, at the long tail, the cap is how much money a society can spend on medicine. So there's an innate cap, and the innate cap then caps that exponentiality. Now, I'll come back to this in a second because I want to polish the point that Steve just made. Societies in the world, the United States has the highest expenditure per GDP of any society in the world. We spend 17.5% of our GDP on medtech, or medicine, broader than medtech. Most of the world is in the 10% range. You guys in Singapore are at about 10%. A lot of the developing world, China, is at about 3.5%, as an example. So there's exponential up to that ceiling. The US has yet to run out of willingness to spend money on medtech, but the US is rapidly running out of money, as you are, I think, all aware of. That I live in a country as my citizenship where our current national debt will exceed our GDP by another 2 years. So we'll actually have more in debt than our annual GDP. That's effectively bankrupt by a financial definition. Okay, so we can be willing to spend 20 or 30% on medtech and not have 20 to 30% to spend. Comment is where I see the opportunity from investment is there's a long distance from here to that cap that's the theoretical cap, because China goes from 3% to pick a number 10, and China's got an economy that will exceed the US economy in another 2 years or 1 year, depending on 3 years, depending on how you count it. So there's a tremendous amount of growth. The tools that you can put in then become vast, the number of new tools and technologies. And I think that goes to Jean-Luc's comment, which is medicine has changed so much. We're at a point now where the number of things you can measure in a patient is infinite. And so the question is, can you create a tool that does that measurement rapidly and efficiently? And then you layer on his comment of informatics. If you create that tool that can do measurement rapidly and efficiently, can the person to whom that data is delivered, aka the clinician, make sense of it? Because it's such a vast amount of data. And then you say, if the answer is that the person who gets that data has to make sense of it using an informatics tool, will the clinician willingly give up their decision authority to an informatics tool? So I think that's probably a more pragmatic limit. And that's where the regulators and other people come in, is from here to the financial limit is far, from here to the pragmatic limit of now we have to ask clinicians to trust data, and that may or may not be in their vested interest. That's a challenge for new technology.
Seemant, you've worked with some of the biggest hospitals and providers in one of the biggest markets in the world. When you think about innovation, sometimes there's this sort of inverse correlation that says the more developed, quote unquote, an economy, the more innovative, a la the United States has held some sort of a crown for a while, whether in reality or perception. But there's a lot of exciting innovation that's coming out of markets like India, where there's new ways, different ways, whether it's a business model, to pick up on Jean-Luc's point, or the actual point of care. When you were looking at these issues up close and personal frequently, what were some of your observations about where India could go on to be a major force in medtech in the years ahead?
Well, for developing markets like India, I think out of the triad around the patient, which we usually talk about, outcomes, access, and affordability, assuming that we stay stationary on the outcomes, the access and affordability takes priority, right? And if you see the need right now emanating from the ground in India, the access and affordability piece right now can only be bridged using some kind of technology. Because organically, we can neither produce that many number of doctors in the time that we have. The need will always outstrip the demand. And in which case, the need for innovation becomes extremely useful in developing economies like India. Now, having said that, I think it's still almost like a conundrum right now, that whilst we are able to come up with innovation and sort of put it on ground, pilot it efficiently, we are still struggling with scaling those pilots so that it actually addresses that need for access and affordability. I saw a lot of innovation coming from Israel, from the Bay Area, coming to Apollo. There were, questions, some of those actually innovations which would add to the efficiency of the process of delivering healthcare. But then came the question, does it actually replace a component in the process, or does it add to the component in the process? And what's the cost of adding that component to the process? If it meant adding to the cost, which ultimately goes to the patient to actually pay out of his pocket, because we don't have insurance as the United States does, then it becomes a second priority in the whole process of delivering health. So you see, for these markets, I think it's a whole big deal to sort of figure out a balance of that, retaining outcomes, but getting your access and affordability. And I'll give you an example. I think it's a new startup which signed up with GE recently for breast cancer screening. And they actually came to us about 4 or 5 years back, and it's FDA approved. But it was FDA approved, if you look at the fine print, it was FDA approved to be used as an adjunct for documentation, as an adjunct to the clinical breast exam. But when you actually put it in the Indian context, it just adds to the cost. So does that make sense? So that's what I see from that perspective, as to you have to have that careful, exquisite balance between those two to make it scalable and successful.
Let me keep my promise and go out early to the audience. Any questions that you want to try and put forward so that we can get people engaged? Yes, please. Oh, Philip, I missed you. I'll come back to you.
Just interested in you helping explain what I think is the disconnect that we have.
I'm sure everybody in the room knows you, but just in case, could you just do a...
So I'm David Barter. I'm from Exploit Technologies, ETPL, part of A-Star. We commercialise medical technologies, and I'm involved in that. So thank you guys for your wisdom. But I'd like to know how we deal with the disconnect. The disconnect being that innovation in medtech often starts by working with clinicians to look at unmet needs. But all of our clinicians here are working in a first world ecosystem. So all of our innovations are going to go to the first world, whereas really our market opportunity is the developing world around us. So how do we deal with that and take advantage of that opportunity?
I don't want to be the person that says anybody want to answer it, so whoever feels compelled.
I'll take it first. I think, there is a huge gap in terms of having any kind of interface across geographies as well, and I think that's really required. Again, from what I've seen over the last 8 years or so, a lot of good healthcare innovations are actually happening in mature markets and in places, hotspots, traditional hotspots like Israel and US. right? And a lot of these innovations are actually very applicable in emerging markets context, but it comes there the last, after, and it's all about also the commercial sense behind it, right? Because the profitability and return on investment is actually faster when you go to the developed world. And it's a completely different animal going to the growth markets, right? You got to go bottom of the pyramid, get the volumes, low margins, and hence the period is longer to returns. Which is where basically if you have an interface, and we need this, which is cross-geography, which can identify the best sort of innovations, maybe from traditional hotspots or from the emerging ones, but are able to position it to the right market. It's all about just mapping and, like we said, connecting the dots. We should be able to get those innovations to the right market and then commercialize them.
Oh, please, Nick.
I'll just add a perspective comment. So you heard the comment about India having a need, and I'm going to presume to make an India comment here, but India having a need for sort of low cost fitting into that demographic. But remember that India also is the country that adopted cell phones per capita faster than any country in the world. And India has pieces of infrastructure that they don't have, gaps. So there are some technologies where, and I'm picking on India with the gentleman to my left being an expert in it, so I'm ashamed to do that. But there are many emerging markets where the local geography actually has a gap. There's not enough doctors, and so therefore you can put in an AI type system, and that might actually save money because it actually provides healthcare. There's also technologies that can go into secondary markets. The world is not uniform on medical cost, and that was the point I was trying to make earlier when I talked about GDP. But you know, a technology that might need to sell in India for $10 to do something and could sell in the US for $100 to do something might end up selling in Indonesia for $50. And that might be enough. So there's a business model across this. And one other comment, some of you may have been at the giant healthcare conference in the US a couple weeks ago, JP Morgan. Bill Gates was up as the first speaker at lunch. And the Gates Foundation does a lot of work where they also take new technologies and fund it into remote markets. And I'm sitting on a board where the Gates Foundation is actually basically paying market rate to provide a diagnostic kit technology to Africa. So the African people are paying $1 for something that costs $50 in the US, and the Gates Foundation is covering the gap. So there's ways as a company to access that.
So, David, thanks for your question. And by the way, I'm on the board of ETPL, so I know this guy very well, and I know his mind. So for the last 10 years, I've done a lot of business model innovation in emerging markets. And I think innovation here, we have to be careful, and maybe I'm going to take the other side of some of the comments that were provided so far. To me, the biggest problem in emerging markets is not really access to technology, because you have ways, as you say, where the access to technology, but it's really the delivery system, the last mile, if you want to use that expression, delivery system, that is so broken because the infrastructure is not there, the transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So we spent, when I was at Medtronic and when I was at Baxter, we spent a lot of time and money on finding those business models that really address the needs of those markets. Funny enough, to me, one of the best innovation in the last 10 years in the cardiovascular space is the Leadless Pacemaker by Medtronic. But the Leadless Pacemaker, we started that project by trying to solve an access issue. And by trying, again, to find a solution to a business model that was broken, we ended up with a technology solution, not the other way around. So that's why I'm talking about flexibility. You have to be able to turn the problem around and looking at it at times from a completely different way, not necessarily technology, but market access, affordability, and all that. And you can come up with extremely creative solutions. I don't have time tonight to talk about what we did in China with Baxter, but it was the same idea. We talked to hospital presidents, asking them, tell us the 3 things that you simply cannot do. We'll find a solution. I mean, I know it was risky. We had no clue what the solution was going to be. But once we heard what their problem was in the hospital, we eventually went back and eventually found some very interesting solutions, including technology. So remember, it has to go both ways.
So what I'm going to do is ask another question on my side, and then I'm going to go back out. I'd like to ask the question, because I'm personally curious as well. I differentiate a bit between this idea of personal medicine and precision medicine, maybe semantics. I think of precision as in more and more granular, better and better targeted. I think of personal as n equals 1. What does it mean to me? So I know that some people say, hey, the best we can do is better segment groups of people, stratify. I like to still think that there's medicine for me, for my microbiome, for who I am. So Nick, do you have a perspective on this topic, that there will be a future in which everyone is treated as n equals 1?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, the reality is that with 8 billion people on the planet headed for 12, there's more than one. I mean, just if you don't know this, statistically, there's at least 2 of you in this planet, right? They may be different ages, but just so you know that there's about 3 billion unique humans. But the point I was going to make is...
It's kind of disturbing. Now I'm kind of freaking out a little bit here. So,
just statistically. It's about 3.6. This is a known number. Anyway, I think what ends up happening is you end up bucketing. So I don't think we get to everybody as their own. I think you end up with larger buckets than one. But I think the issue is, if the diagnostic tool, whether diagnostic means looking at your genome or looking at your proteome or looking at your metabolome or epigenome or these ohms, if the diagnostic tool becomes cheap enough, then there's no reason not to start making small buckets. Then the question is, does the treatment become the limit? And I think that's what I see. I personally see that the tools that will segment you, the individual, into relatively small buckets are better and closer to market than the treatment size for that bucket. So I think we're going to get into a regime where we say, this therapeutic is good for 10 million people on the planet, and I can differentiate any 100,000. But by the way, this treatment's 10 million, so I can't get finer treatment. I think that's where we end up, but we're close.
So to try and pick up on that briefly, so Viome, for example, with a $399 microbiome kit, and with any number of people for genome sequencing. So your point is, for $1,500 to $2,000, you can know a heck of a lot about yourself, but what happens next? As in the treatment, you sort of are still able to make use of whatever the larger population is able to get. So, I'm sorry.
Can I make a half comment?
Absolutely.
Pass it? I was going to say, I live in the financial fantasy of that future, and investor people in Silicon Valley who want to pour unlimited money into Guardant or Grail to do that. But remember that Verily, which is the Google Life Science, I mean, they have an injectable bead that they stick into you and a little wristwatch that reads it out, and it looks at pick your subject in real time. Exists today.
So,
not approved.
So, Seemant, when you take a look at this concept then of more and more information per person, but not necessarily some of the treatment, you were close to the caregivers, close to the hospital infrastructure and the clinicians. Is it something where you think that doctors, the actual point of care, will be excited about people walking in, people like me that walk in with half a dozen sheets of paper and say, look at all this amazing information about myself, what should we do next? Or is that something where physicians say, hey, you know what, I hate people that Google their condition before they come see me?
I think I'll qualify that answer by saying I think probably depends on the market you're also going and the extent to which the doctor reacts. If you come to developing markets, and I wanted to sort of elaborate and validate what Nick was saying, is we introduced genetic predispositions at Apollo, plugged it into our annual health check program. We did about 200,000 health checks in a year, and we gave an option to people to know more about themselves with a clear structure that at one point in time we will, because it's the annual health check, we have the entire clinical set of readings on one side, and on the other side we have the clinical, the genetic predisposition. The idea was we're going to combine both of those and to be able to give a cumulative risk index, which kind of changes the way the doctor should look at the patient. Very simple stuff in that sense that if you have a high or a borderline cholesterol levels on your clinical side, but a high predisposition, it just tilts the sort of needle towards focusing a little bit more on your heart side of health, right? And so you should sort of probably increase the frequency with which you get your, consultations done with your cardiologist, or probably just get a lipid profile test, maybe not once in a year, but maybe twice in a year. That's simple. But unfortunately, the challenges with that are, all the doctors are not trained in genetics. And so despite deploying genetic counselors, we actually ran into the problem of the clinicians actually understanding the value of this test and being able to assimilate all that information to in the first part, not even assimilate that information, but to actually make it effective. That was a long shot. So it kind of sort of petered down from there. It still remains a buzzword and an interest area, but not really scaled up to that extent. And to coming to the second question that you asked, a doctor's going to be excited about more data coming their way. I think it's, again, if you go to developing world, I think the problem is of getting basics right and in terms of delivering quality health. And then comes this monster of saying, hey, is this data going to overtake me? I can't understand this data, and so many data points to crunch. So unless, some of these AI companies which are coming in with imaging systems, which really are actually trying to standardize better outcomes, they are perceived as threats right now. But I guess it'll go its own cycle, saying that we're only trying to help you get better outcomes and higher throughputs, and then eventually come around to saying, at some point in time, replacing some of these radiologists and stuff like that. So,
Philip, I think you had a question.
My name is Philip Wong. I'm a doctor by training and founder of two Medtech companies. My question is more from the investor point of view. And tonight's theme is basically de-risking early stage Medtech companies. So may I ask, as an investor, if you have a business plan in front of you, what specific factors you are looking at or characteristics you are looking at in this startup company that makes you decide whether you want to invest in that company or not? Second question is, do you think there is a difference between the characteristics that you look at in the East, a company that is started in the East or in the Asia Pacific compared to that in the West?
I'll take, by the way, I know this gentleman as well. So let me do a little bit of advertising for him. He's one of the very best cardiovascular doctors in the world. So anybody with cardiovascular issues, go see him, okay? Now, it's true, by the way. So on the first point, Philip, and by the way, I'm not an investor as you guys are, but there's one thing I always look for. And I've tend to maybe overuse what I'm going to say, but I'm a firm believer of that because I've seen it at work. If someone comes to me with a business plan and they don't understand what I call the 3 basic flows of their market, they won't get a dime. And the flows in our industry is, do you really understand the patient flow? Can you break it down for me? How you go from early detection to final cure? Let's just use that as a range, okay? Second, do you understand the money flow? Because if you come with your new technology, guess what? It's a zero-sum game most of the time. So you're going to take money from somebody else. So you've got to understand the money flow, because you may be taking that money directly from a doctor that has better incentive to stay with some other technology platform. You may be taking it from the hospital that pays less for a treatment. So understand the money flow, understand who you are going to displace. And the last one, it's funny because I make those 3 flows different. In a way, they should be one flow, but the system is such that they are different. And the last one is, do you understand the clinical flow? And you go into some health systems, and it's amazing. Those flows are completely different. It's almost like you deal with 3 different entities. So if the person that shows up, for investment, and they can't even describe that they have a basic understanding of these 3 flows, don't waste my time. So that to me is, and again, I speak from experience on this one. I feel very, very strongly.
Nick, do you want to tackle the East-West?
Yeah, I couldn't have answered that question better, by the way. I think that was brilliant.
Thank you.
Took notes. Yeah, the East-West, I think what you look for as an investor is not different, but I'll leverage exactly what Jean-Luc said. There is a domain difference. If for some reason you feel like you can get your early market for your technology here or in this general region, those flows, to use his terminology, are very different than the flows in the US. If for some reason you need to put your technology in the US, then those flows are in the US. So I would add one comment. I would do all of those things, perfectly stated. I would add one comment. I also look for the team, because in most things that I'm privileged to see, the technology's relatively proof of tech is okay. Understanding of the market's thin, this whole comment. And then are the people behind it actually willing to do what it takes to take a business from zero to some level where they can then bring in better people or equal people?
Yes, please. Abhijit.
Hey, thank you. My name is Abhijit. I represent Decagon Capital. We are a cross-border tech VC with a portion of our portfolio in Medtech. So we often talk about connecting the dots, and when it comes to deep tech, the benchmark is often Israel. And we often see that Israeli companies, early stage companies, with the innovation that they do, for them, for adoption, scale, and even monetization, their path is to go to the US. And that's where they can scale quickly, and they can also bite the bitter pill by going for FDA approval. And once they get that, probably the world opens up faster for them, having crossed the regulatory hurdle through FDA. Now, what is the path? And often benchmarks are being drawn about deep tech coming out of Singapore. And Seemant, you mentioned that. So where do these deep tech companies go for scale, adoption, crossing the regulatory hurdle? So where is the US? Like the Israeli companies have US for them, for their scale, for their glory. What is there for the early stage Singapore companies, the deep tech or the medtechs which are coming out from here? Where do they go for that? Which market is giving them that scale, the adoption, the monetization path?
Tough question, actually. I think in terms of embracing technology, whilst the need is very high in emerging markets, the speed with which you embrace tech, deep tech in developing world is still, I would say, very slow. The speed with which we embrace it is very slow. Although we can do with a lot of it, again, to Jean-Luc's point earlier, some of this is actually required more to actually provide and expedite that access. So really no easy answer to that one, but I guess it needs to go around that circle of getting proved somewhere and sort of coming back out here. But at the same time, having said that, and I was going to reply to the question earlier, I think one of the things in the business plan which also makes a lot of sense is to have variants or components of this business plan customized for the different markets. And what I've seen as a trend also in some of the smarter companies is with deep tech is they have two elements. One's for emerging markets and one's for developed markets. And with the emerging markets, the number of the data sets, etc., that they're able to get, the speed with which they're able to get is actually faster out here in emerging markets, which gives them the credentials, which gives them the data sets. And if they're putting in an international study to sort of expedite their run to FDAs, then this actually helps them in the process to actually go commercial there. But with an eye of commercialization here in the East as well. So having two legs in your strategy, if you have a deep tech, which is coming out from here, will actually help you in that situation.
So this is a great question. So one of the startup I advise is based in India, and they're actually based in India and then Boston, okay? And they wanted to rush to get to FDA approval and let's get into the US on that. And actually I forced them, I said, listen, develop your business model in India, so you can do the manufacturing, so you can do the customer service, because it's back. Because the patient acquisition cost in India is so low. So in terms of early stage investment, it's not much. So now we have about 80,000 patients on that platform in India. And we have been able to debug the entire supply chain, the manufacturing, the quality and all that, the customer service. And now we are going to the US for an FDA approval because we have proved that we have a system that works. We have cost under control, we have quality under control and all that. So often, I think people, now Israeli companies are a little bit different because of the access to capital and all that, okay? But I think too often people want to rush to the big developed markets, and they should go there because that's where the big money eventually happens. But if you can do your development of your entire business model in one of these less developed markets, I think there's a huge benefit because that platform, we know the diagnostic, it's a diagnostic platform. That platform we know works in the US. And now we have a business model that is about 70% cheaper than what you find in the US, and it works. So I think we should think more carefully about taking our time to develop the local market and then switch to the big markets, the developed markets.
Right. So as you, in continuation of that, as you rightly said, markets like India, collecting clinical data, et cetera, there's huge opportunity there. But when it comes to Singaporean startups, they have difficulty both in collecting clinical data because the large data sets that you mentioned is often not available, and the path towards getting that is difficult. And then, of course, then comes the question of adoption and scale. So that's where I think a lot of these deep tech companies which are in the medical and health sector, they often face this challenge of lacking speed to market because others from other parts of the world can quickly probably overtake them. So the question is of the vulnerability that these deep tech founders are facing because of the lack of their ability to go to speed into the market.
So that's why this man is in his job heading SGInnovate because he's helping those companies do that. So talk to him. Okay.
Good answer. The ball is passed. Thank you.
But yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Just a quick comment. The world of market for what we defined as deep tech is heterogeneous, right? So if I characterized what you heard from Seemant and Jean-Luc as there's a time value of money equation, you can plug that in. So it's not digital, it's not the US or India, because we all hear the numbers, right? But there's hundreds of millions of wealthy people in China who will pay directly. There's tens of millions of people who are medical tourists in Thailand who get very expensive medical treatment. So there's a heat map, and I think the question for the company and the investor is, you do the heat map and you say the US is X years because it's got to go through the FDA, but it's big, and Thailand is X minus 2 years because there's no FDA. It's very simplistic. Therefore, how many patients, back to the flows.
So I've been advised that it's time for us to do some other things and have some food. So here's the question that I'd like to ask as a walking off question. If we generally agree that Singapore has great education and a commitment to research and some amazing people from around the world that call Singapore home to do that research, whether it's an A-star or the universities or elsewhere, but we're not seeing the companies, right? So the question then becomes, what role does Singapore play? So if it's not a market, and I'm looking at you on this one, Abhijit, which is point taken, the question then becomes, it's got to be greater than we wish we could, but we cannot. So what role do we play? Because we're originating and discovering a number of things. Many people that we see, each of us see every day, every week, many people in the room see every day, every week. But our collective frustration is how to help them in a meaningful way. The easy answer would be get them over to Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Tel Aviv, or somewhere else. Is there another answer, and if so, is it primarily a regulatory perspective? Is it primarily an adoption perspective? Because I don't accept that the size of the market Israel is not itself a big market. So I think what we have to do is let's put that to the side. As a walking off question before we move on to the rest of the evening, May I ask just for a brief comment from each of the three of you? Some things are taken as given in Singapore. We accept that we're not doing as much as we'd like. Is there something that sticks out to you as a flashing light that said, gee, if you confronted this, that would be important to change the game? And I don't mind who goes first or how you want to tackle it, because I'm also searching for some of those.
So I'm going to say something, or I'm going to say, please, this comment stays in the room, which is really stupid because I know it won't, but I'll say it anyway. I think we have, so maybe my answer, Steve, is not really directly related, but it talks about the ecosystem in Singapore. And so we have a great benefit in Singapore, but we have a great liability. The benefit is that the government is extremely involved. And the government, as we have for SGInnovate, funds a lot of activities. There are so many schemes available between, Spring, the old Spring and SGInnovate and all that to help companies start. But that, in a way, completely skews the definition of risk capital. And so the other side of that coin is that's a liability because people rely on the government all the time. And so the proper definition of risk capital and the entrepreneur is someone that takes a risk has been skewed by the generosity and the foresight of the government. So I think that's part of the problem. I will let the others give the answer to the problem.
Thank you. That's smart. No, I couldn't have said it better. I will amplify that comment, and then I'll give you a little bit of extra perspective. But to amplify the comment, if you think about it, I mean, I live in Silicon Valley, right? If you come to me as a startup company, you're 5 people, and you have an idea, and you want $1 million, that's the first $1 million. And so my return expectation on that might be 10x of that $1 million. In Singapore, by the time you're raising your hand for money, someone, the government, has put in $10 million. So their minimum expectation somewhere in the brain of Singapore is that everybody with 5 people who raises their hand needs to be a $100 million company. And I've heard people even say, oh, everything has to be a unicorn, which is $1 billion by definition company. I think that's the problem. The problem is whether it's contamination by this early seed money, which creates this great thing but then raises an expectation, or whether it's an understanding of the time it takes to be a $100 million company and to be a $1 billion company, thus the deep tech. I think that's the problem. You have to have the risk of people to be willing to sit in a company, to be willing to invest in a company, to be willing to go 5 years, 6 years without a return. That's the definition of deep.
Smart.
I think I believe that at a different life cycle stage of a startup, there are different roles to be played by different stakeholders here. SGInnovate is trying at the early stage of this and to put companies in the pipeline. I think that's also required. I think, in my opinion, what I've seen, even in India, most of research, whatever happens, is in government labs. They have so much money, but we have really seen no IP per se. India is not known for generating IP, despite having the talent, technology, but we don't have IP. And that's because a lot of infra is there, a lot of resources are there. They're able to generate papers, but they're not able to generate, they're even able to generate some IP, but not commercialize and sort of put it in the world out there in the industry. Now that's where I feel if one were to actually zoom out and we were to actually just put, and this is fairly in the ideal world, but if one were to actually put all these schemes and all these stakeholders on the map and have this nice mega map sized out where we can actually, that serves as a roadmap option for the startups that are coming out from Singapore. You will be able to actually provide them an a la carte menu of sorts saying, level 1, you need to go hop 10 levels, and this is level 2, where you actually have these as potential candidates, and after a couple of iterations, actually the options become lesser for you. These 3 are the ones you should go for, level 3, and so on and so forth. And there, you're actually playing with some kind of structure, such structured roadmap to actually lead on to something. And you will know there is going to be attrition along the way. Some are going to fall in the valley of death, but some are actually going to come out with some success.
All right, so our goal was and is and continues to be to find a way for us to continue to move on the research that's been originated in Singapore or expanded in Singapore, and to have that be the foundation of something that's a positive contributor, not only to Singapore economy, but to people's lives around the world. We don't know the answer. We're in pursuit of finding those areas of improvement. We're very open to feedback and suggestions, but the mission remains the same, which is find ways to back and work with amazing men and women that are trying to do something important. So these three leaders have offered a perspective. I think we're going to go have some food and continue to spend some time together. So please join me first in saying thank you.